Okay. Now, the final lecture of this week is going to be a discussion of internal validity. We're going to be discussing threats to internal validity. As a part of your final proposal project, which isn't due for some time, you are going to need to include three potential threats to the internal validity of your study. Now, this will make more sense later, but I will encourage you yet again to look at the example papers and look at their discussion sections and see how they describe potential threats to the internal validity of their studies. So hopefully this will make more sense after I discuss it. So you have internal validity in your study when changes in the dependent variable are directly related to changes in your independent variable. Okay, not something else. You have a threat to internal validity when changes in your dependent variable are not related to your independent variable. Think back to the Hawthorne experiment that I discussed in the first half of the semester. Remember that their productivity did not increase because of their new uniforms or the second coffee pot or better lighting. It was because they knew they were being watched. So that study had a serious threat to the internal validity of their study. Now, the first time I saw a lecture about this, 100 years ago, I thought that this was just a way to make a neat chapter in a research textbook. But I can promise you that I've seen almost every one of these threats to internal validity in my career as a researcher. So I'm going to take you through some of the more popular types of threats to internal validity. Maybe not popular, but a bit more common. Sometimes when you're assigning people to an experimental or control group, sometimes there are differences that exist. Even when you do things randomly, sometimes differences just exist. So this was some time ago, back in 2004, where I was collecting data about alcohol and drug use among students at a high school. And one school was randomly assigned to be the experimental group, and one school was randomly assigned to be the control group or the comparison group here. And what I'm hoping you'll see here is that the comparison group and the experimental group were not the same. The comparison group had much higher drinking and drug use. So despite my best efforts, despite using randomization, I still had a selection bias. So any differences that I might see between the experimental or control group may not be due to my independent variable, but may more likely be due to the fact that the groups were fundamentally different at the beginning of the experiment. Another potential threat to the internal validity of your study is mortality. Sometimes, in fact, it's very common to lose participants in your study over the course of the study. Now, this is called mortality. This does not necessarily mean that they pass, but rather it could also mean that they just choose not to be a part of your study. So I was working, and this was again back in 2004. I was working with a university, and they were measuring the number of people or the percent of their student body that drank five or more drinks whenever they hung out with their friends and partied. So in October, we took a measurement. We found that 42% of the freshmen um, uh, drank five or more when they partied with their friends. Then we took a measurement in the spring semester in March of 2005, and still about 500 people. And we found that about 40% of them drank five or more when they were partying with their friends. We took another measurement among the sophomores the following year. Now, here we didn't have all 500 people. We had 400 people, which meant that 20% of our participant pool had left the university. And here we find that only 33% of the people reported drinking five or more drinks when they partied with their friends. Now, the school was like, Yahoo, our intervention worked. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. Do you think that there's something different about the people who stuck around versus the people who left? And they all look around uncomfortably and they're like, yeah, I suppose that that's true. What ended up happening here is that the people who left the university between their freshman and sophomore year were the heaviest drinkers. So their intervention really didn't have any impact at all. It's just that the people who weren't going to succeed because they were drinking too much dropped out of college. So this is an example of a mortality threat. This is very common. Whenever somebody leaves the experiment, you have to make an assumption that that the people who left the experiment are somehow different than the people who stayed in the experiment, and that can offer a threat to your validity. Sometimes the location of where you conduct your experiment can have an effect. I was working with a school, and it shouldn't surprise you, it was in the drug and alcohol field, and they were able to give the survey to almost the entire school. Like, let's say 90% of the school during homeroom. It was a very controlled environment, and it was, and that was the right way to collect the data. But then there were people who couldn't be there during their homework because they were in different classes or they were excused from homeroom, and so that amounted to about 10% of the school. So we collected, or I should say, they collected the data for that 10% of people in a cafeteria, which is not a controlled environment. In fact, it's a terrible environment for collecting alcohol and drug data. And what they ended up finding is that the classroom sample, remember 90% of the people who were surveyed during their homeroom had much lower cigarette, alcohol, and drug use than the cafeteria sample. And they said, wow, those people who weren't in the classroom, they're much heavier drinkers. And I said, well, that isn't necessarily true. It might be that the people in the cafeteria were in an uncontrolled environment and it allowed them to kind of screw around with the data a bit more. So any data you get from this, any findings you get from this, you have to assess the cafeteria and classroom separately because they were measured in different locations. This happens a lot. Sometimes the way you ask a question can impact the way the way people answer that question. And sometimes even the smallest, most innocuous changes can affect the way people answer those questions. And this is something I see all the time in survey research. People change a survey item in a very small way, and then it changes the data incredibly. So here's an example. So in from the years 2005 to 2007, we were just starting to get into the oxy craze. We asked the question during the past 30 days, on how many days did you use prescription drugs that were not prescribed to you by a doctor? And then we provided examples of Ritalin, Adderall, Vicodin, OxyContin. And then there were some complaints among the staff members at the school, and they said this question is too long. So they decided to remove the examples in 2008. So they asked the exact same question, but they removed the examples. So here are the results for this question over that 4-year period. You'll notice that or I should say that the prescription drug use was very consistent between 2005 and 2007. But in 2008, the year that they changed the question, it looks like the prescription drug use went through the roof. And of course, they were panicking, saying, "What's happening with prescription drug use?" And I said, "Well, we definitely want to be concerned about this. There are a couple choices here. One, there's actually been an increase in prescription drug use among your students, or two, the way you asked the questions affected them, and they answered the question differently." And if I were to go back to the previous slide, you'll remember that the prescription drug use was limited to, I'm going to say, generally mind-altering types of drugs. They were depressants or stimulants or something like that. But when we remove those as examples, now any prescription drug is really available. If you feel like you're coming down with strep throat and your mom has some leftover penicillin or your caregiver has some leftover penicillin, you might decide to take that. That counts now. So again, you don't know if the increase in a prescription drug use is because A, there was actually an increase in prescription drug use, or B, changing the question removed that context that you were talking about these type of drugs, not any type of drugs. Sometimes the very act of testing somebody over and over and over again makes them more familiar with the content, and then they end up doing better. I think about an ACT test. If you were to take an ACT test over and over and over again, even though it's a really reliable test, if you took it 6 times over the course of 6 weeks with no new learning, your score would likely go up. Not because you've learned anything, but just because you've become more comfortable with the testing environment. So then you have a testing threat. So you didn't get smarter, not you, because you're all getting smarter, but somebody else didn't get smarter or learn more material. They just happen to be taking the test a lot. It's kind of a practice thing. Sometimes the attitude of the subjects can have an effect. This would be like the Hawthorne effect. The people's productivity did not go up because of the independent variable, but because they felt like it was nice that they were at least asked how they could make their lives better. Sometimes other things happen that have nothing to do with your study, and this is called a history threat. An example that I like to give here is, as I was involved with a high school, and we were studying drugs and alcohol. And one of the things I always study is the perception of drug or alcohol use. I like to know what people think other people are doing. And so their perception rates were very consistent over numerous years. And then one year, the perception went through the roof. And I was shocked because you never see this sort of thing. So I contacted the school. I'm like, look, did anything else happen in the last year that would have changed the perception question? And this is one of those horribly tragic moments where they said, well, there was something kind of big that happened in this last year. Our prom queen and prom king were killed in a drunk driving accident on prom night. And this was horribly tragic. But can you imagine what the impact of having two of the more popular students in the school die in a drunk driving accident would have on other students' perception of drinking? So, perception of drinking did not go up because of any independent variable or anything like that. It went up because something horribly tragic happened in the school, and this is a history effect. Sometimes your measurement can change just because people mature. As an example, in the drinking world, there's kind of like this weird phenomena that occurs that among high school students, drinking rates increase from when they go from freshman to sophomore to junior to senior year. And that's going to occur regardless of any intervention. So that doesn't have anything to do with an independent variable. As students get older, they tend to drink more. And then we have the reverse phenomena when students get to college. Now, again, this is generally speaking, but usually students drink a bit more during their freshman and sophomore year, and then it tapers off by the time they get to their junior and senior year. It's like by the time they reach 21, they're like, this isn't that exciting anymore. So any changes in drinking have nothing to do with your independent variable. Rather, it just has to do because people mature or perversely mature. Sometimes a group of people might do very poorly on a test, for example, or give a very poor measurement. And then the second time you take a measurement, it looks better. And this may not have to do with the intervention. This may just be a regression threat because sometimes somebody will score so low or so high that the changes aren't due to the intervention. They're just changes are due because they can't get any worse or they can't get any better. Sometimes threats to internal validity happen because the experimental group or the control group are treated differently. Okay, and I'm not talking about the intervention. I'm saying that they're treated differently. And here's a group of them that kind of get at that same concept. Sometimes the experimental group might be given more than they were supposed to. I worked with a school that had a great effect on reducing alcohol use. And I said, isn't this great? The social norms intervention worked because that's what we were using. And they said, oh, yeah, that worked. And we also did all this other stuff. And so then I said, okay, well, what was it? The social norms intervention or all this other stuff? So that was an implementation threat. Sometimes there's a diffusion of treatment. I was working with two schools. One was the experimental group and one was the control group. And over the course of time, I noticed that they had the exact same effect of reducing alcohol. And so I started thinking, and I started talking to the schools, and I should have known better. This was years ago, but the two schools were 10 miles apart from one another, the experimental and the control schools. And so the parents, the students, they communicated with each other. So the people in the experimental school told the people in the control school about what was going on in that school. And so the control school learned, and there was a diffusion of treatment. So that was a threat to validity as well. Sometimes the control group gets something else. They get something extra. This is kind of the opposite of the implementation group. There was a school once that wasn't supposed to get anything, but they knew they were the control school, or they figured out that they were the control school, so they started doing stuff. And so now it's no longer an equivalent control group. Sometimes the control group will try harder because they know they're not the experimental group. That's an example of compensatory rivalry. Sometimes the control group knows that they're the control group, and so they just give up. They just kind of slack off. So all of these things can happen in your research, and they're not in any way related to the independent variable. They're related to something else, and that is really the essence of internal validity. Now, there are some things that you can do to control or minimize threats to internal validity. First of all, standardize, standardize, standardize. Make sure that if you're collecting data in one environment at time one, you're collecting the data in that exact same environment at time two. Make sure that you're collecting data in the same type of environment for the experimental and control group. Get as much information as you can get about the subjects and anything else that's been happening. Think about history effects. Think about if you're measuring, for example, drug and alcohol use, what are the other sorts of things that might happen? There was this show, God, what was it called? It was like 13 Reasons Why, and it was about teen suicide. And you wouldn't believe the impact that that show had on measurements of suicidal thoughts among high school students. That had nothing to do with an intervention. It's just because it was a very popular show, it was watched by a lot of people, and it affected measurements. You always want to make sure you choose the appropriate design, and perhaps the most important thing is to make sure you have an equivalent control group. Without a control group, it is very difficult to to assess the impact of an independent variable, and always recognize that you can't control all the threats to validity, but by standardizing, getting as much information as possible, having an equivalent control group, you can try to minimize those threats to internal validity. Please remember that you need to think of three potential threats to the internal validity of your study for the final stage of the proposal, and this will go in the discussion section. I'll say yet again today, please review the example papers because many of them have great examples of threats to internal validity. And as ever, I am available to discuss this and any other concerns that you might have through Teams. So I will talk to you again.